Okay, let's dive in. Some thinkers, their ideas feel like these dense, complex puzzles, almost intimidating.
Mm.
And Theodor W. Adorno, he's definitely one of those. His name pops up, Frankfurt-School, critiques of pop music, Hollywood, and it can feel a bit daunting.
Yeah, his system, his language, it demands a bit of wrestling, doesn't it?
Absolutely. But what if engaging with those very ideas, those sometimes difficult concepts, actually gives you a much sharper way to look at the world around you, the world you live in right now?
That's really the core of it, I think. Adorno wasn't just describing things. He was deep in conversation with, Kant, Hegel, Husserl, Marx, the big names.
Right.
But he wasn't just rehashing them. The sources we're looking at show he was after something new, a reformed conceptuality, even a whole new concept of philosophy. His big project was trying to get a handle on experience, knowledge, society, specifically in modernity, after the Enlightenment, industrialization, all that.
And what's really interesting and makes him relevant outside academia is that his work, according to one source, provides a philosophical foundation to the very practice of critical theory. It's about giving us tools.
Exactly. Tools to understand why things are the way they are,
Yeah.
especially the things that feel wrong or alienating or just off about modern life. It's a kind of diagnosis, you could say, rooted in some heavy philosophical lifting.
So our mission here for this deep dive is to really dig into the source material you've got, and it's a great mix. We have companions to his philosophy, analyses of his cultural critiques, some biography, even bits from his own notoriously tough stuff like Minima Moralia or the Authoritarian personality.
Range, yeah.
And we want to pull out the key ideas, understand his main philosophical moves, his pretty biting critique of modern culture and society, and this is crucial. See how it all connects to whether it's even possible or how difficult it is to live ethically, to stay critical today.
We're aiming to connect these, let's face it, sometimes abstract ideas, directly to things you experience. The media you watch, how you listen to music, maybe even how you feel about things. These different sources give us multiple angles, hopefully leading to some real aha moments.
Sounds good. Let's start then with Adorno's view on modern culture and society itself. He saw it as, well, fundamentally flawed. He even used the term wrong life. And a huge part of this comes from that landmark book he wrote with Max Horkheimer, Dialectic of Enlightenment. Famously difficult, that one.
Oh yeah, and its central argument, it's still incredibly provocative, basically. Myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to mythology. It completely messes with the simple idea of progress.
Okay, hold on. That sounds like a total contradiction. Enlightenment was supposed to be reason conquering myth, right? Getting rid of superstition. How does it flip back?
Well, their analysis digs into this kind of hidden trajectory in Western thought. Yes, the aim was to dispel myths, free people from fear through reason and control over nature. But in a way, the myths that Enlightenment defeated were kind of its own creations, its unspoken assumptions. As reason became the main tool, the only tool, it got reduced. It became purely instrumental.
Instrumental, meaning...
Meaning it's just about self-preservation, efficiency, domination. Controlling nature, sure, but also controlling other people, even controlling parts of ourselves. It lost its connection to thinking about values, about the why.
So reason just becomes a tool to achieve any goal, no matter what that goal is. It doesn't question the goal itself.
That's the core of the critique. It becomes indifferent to content, really. As long as it serves power or control or the system, it's considered rational. And any thinking that steps outside that questions the purpose of it all. The sources say it gets dismissed. Oh, that's just poetry or empty metaphysics. Useless sentiment.
So the tool meant to liberate ends up suppressing the deeper questions.
Precisely. It flattens thought. Reason becomes a tool for conformity, not freedom.
Which suggests that the very engine of progress, enlightenment itself, contains the seeds of its own reversal. It can lead back to a new kind of myth, a new kind of irrationality, by devaluing any thought that doesn't serve the system.
Exactly. And that really sets the stage for Adorno's critique of modern society. It's a place where our best tools can turn against us. The promise of reason gets twisted.
And this twisting of reason is maybe clearest in his concept of the culture industry. That specific term, why not just mass culture?
Ah, that choice was deliberate and crucial. Mass culture sounds like it bubbles up from the people, right? Like it reflects their genuine tastes.
Yeah, it sounds organic.
But culture industry insists, no, this is manufactured. It's produced from the top down by powerful centralized interests, specifically for mass consumption. The products are designed to be sold And that economic logic shapes everything about them. It creates this seamless system, almost without gaps.
And the sources emphasize it integrates consumers from above. It's not democratic.
None in the slightest. And they argue it has disastrous effects on real art, real culture. It forces high art and low art together in a way that damages both. High art starts looking over its shoulder at the market, worrying about efficacy, watering itself down to be palatable. It loses its critical bite, its seriousness.
And meanwhile, what might have been genuine popular art, maybe something with a bit of rebellion or authenticity.
It gets smoothed out. It loses that resistant edge because it has to fit the formulas, the distribution channels of the industry. Anything too unique, too challenging gets either rejected or co-opted, turned into just another product.
So the audience, the masses, they aren't driving this. They're, as the source says, an object of calculation, an appendage of the machinery.
Yes, the critique is sharp there. The customer isn't king. They're the target. Adorno and Horkheimer even found the term mass media problematic. They felt it distracted from the real power dynamic, the master's voice, by focusing on the neutral technology or the abstract idea of the masses. Any apparent concern for the masses, they argued, is actually used by the industry to duplicate, reinforce, and strengthen their mentality. It just gives people more of what they already think, solidifying existing attitudes for easier control rather than challenging them.
You know, thinking about that today, digital media, algorithms, learning your preferences, streaming services, pumping out content designed purely to keep you hooked, social media optimizing for engagement. That idea of manufactured system integrating you by feeding you more of what you already like, reinforcing your mindset, and it feels incredibly spot on, almost chillingly so.
It maps frighteningly well, doesn't it? The mechanisms might be more complex now, maybe more hidden, but that core idea of shaping consciousness for commercial and ultimately ideological ends, it's still powerfully relevant. Adorno pushes us to ask, who benefits from this? Is this endless stream of tailored stuff actually enriching us or just making us more predictable, more manageable?
And Adorno didn't just critique the overall system, he drilled down into specific cultural forms. He argued, for instance, that genuine folk culture had basically disappeared because modern society, with its logic of efficiency and calculation, bourgeois rationalization, had taken over everything.
Right. And popular music was a major target for him. He often saw it, perhaps controversially, using simplified, obsolete bits of classical or art music, dumbing them down into just harmless entertainment. And because it's just entertainment, people don't take it seriously, don't analyze its function, which allows it to quietly promote conformity.
His concern wasn't just the music itself, but how it trained people to listen. Radio, the whole dominant music culture, he argued, encouraged you to just pick out the catchy bits, the culinary moments, that hook, that solo.
The immediate gratification.
Instead of engaging with the whole structure, the development, the tension between the parts and the whole, which you find in more complex music.
There's that great example in the source listening for the horn solo in Brahms, in the same way you wait for the Benny Goodman clarinet break. For Adorno, this isn't just taste. It reflects a broader psychological weakening, a reduced capacity to deal with complexity, with anything that requires sustained attention and thought. Listening becomes passive consumption of easy pleasures, not active engagement.
It seems like a pattern. This loss of the ability for deep critical engagement keeps coming up.
It's absolutely central. And he saw the same thing in Hollywood films. He pointed to this pervasive code of bourgeois decency, this sort of sentimental, cleaned-up view of life as the soft core. But what's really fascinating is his psychological insight into how audiences react. People know life isn't like the movies, right? They see the gap.
Yeah, obviously.
But instead of critiquing the movie's falseness, they find a weird kind of comfort in that difference. It's almost like the unrealistic perfection on screen validates their own messy reality, makes it feel inevitable. Identifying with the unattainable glamour gives this odd sense of vicarious satisfaction.
Comfort in the gap between art and life. That's perverse.
It is perverse. The sources suggest it reinforces resignation. Well, life isn't like that, so I guess my struggles are just how things are. It doesn't spark a desire for change. And the whole celebrity worship thing fits right in projecting ideals onto these distant figures.
But Adorno went even further, looking at things most people wouldn't even consider culture in that sense, like newspaper astrology columns.
Yes. His analysis of astrology is surprisingly detailed in one source. He saw it as a perfect, everyday example of the culture industry manipulating dependency needs. He even calls the connection between the individual and these mass phenomena libidinal, meaning it taps into deep psychological drives and needs that are then exploited.
How does astrology exploit dependency?
Well, first, it's obviously irrational, right? The predictions are arbitrary.
Yeah.
But crucially, it presents this irrationality as coming from this grand, impersonal source, the stars. And this impersonal, mysterious force, Adorno argues, mirrors the feeling people have about modern society itself opaque, controlled by forces you don't understand. Projecting your lack of control onto the stars gives it a kind of cosmic dignity. It becomes fate.
So it's easier to accept the verdict of the stars, however absurd, than to do the hard, uncomfortable work of figuring out the actual social and economic forces shaping your life, which might require critical thinking and cause discomfort.
It's exactly that. Astrology offers an easy out. Accept the absurdity, externalize your powerlessness. One source mentions the typical biphasic advice. Work hard in the AM, focus on relationships or pleasure in the PM. Seems balanced, right? But Adorno says this structure subtly reinforces conformity. It makes everything success, happiness seem like it's all down to you and your stars, not objective conditions you might challenge.
Pleasure for duty's sake, the source calls it. Even your downtime serves the system.
Right. Pleasure becomes just another way to recharge so you can get back to work. It reinforces the work ethic, the rational, calculating self, even when technology might make relentless work seem less necessary. It subtly keeps you focused on individual adjustment, not social critique.
And this ties into Adorno's broader point about how, in modern society, our dependence on large systems and powerful groups becomes more obvious, more direct. It's not just the hidden hand of the market, it's the direct verdict of the groups at the helm.
And facing that dependence head-on can feel humiliating. So Adorno suggests people might unconsciously project that dependence outwards, maybe even wish to reinforce it, to avoid the responsibility of challenging it. Astrology and similar things provide a ready-made ideology for this dependence. It makes powerlessness feel natural, even cosmic, instead of social and changeable.
And the link he makes from this to fascist propaganda is, well, it's chilling.
Extremely. The sources explicitly connect the techniques. Both astrology and fascist propaganda prey on these dependency needs. They describe the fascist leader figure, using Hitler as an example, not as some distant authority, but more like a glorified elder brother, the great little man, relatable almost. One source uses that striking phrase, a composite of King Kong and the suburban barber.
Blending power and folksiness. And the appeal isn't rational.
No, it's libidinal, psychological. Followers project their own idealized self onto the leader, and the propaganda itself. Adorno noted its amazing stereotypy, its rigid repetition. Simple slogans, black and white thinking, scapegoats, repeated relentlessly. Like the jitterbug dancer needing the predictable beat, the follower craves this rigid certainty. It's a defense mechanism against complexity, against the anxiety of critical thought. It shores up the fragile self.
Which brings us directly to how all this societal stuff impacts the individual, creating what Adorno termed the damaged self.
He uses Freud here, ego managing reality, ego driving primitive desires. Adorno argues that in our modern, reified world where human relations feel like interactions between things, people experience a withdrawal of the instincts. Our basic drives pull back from an external reality that feels alienating, overly controlled.
And this withdrawal, being deprived of the object, the connection to the world, leads to the self kind of decaying, losing its boundaries, regressing to narcissistic unity.
Yes. The energy turns inward. But because the self is already damaged, this inward turn doesn't lead to strength. It's a kind of self-denial, trapped in its own defenses, unable to genuinely engage or change reality. This creates the pseudo-individual, someone who looks independent on the surface, but is actually shaped by external pressures and internal defenses, lacking true autonomy.
And the authoritarian personality study explored the traits associated with this.
Exactly. Things like rigid conventionalism, submission to authority but aggression towards outgroups, suspicion of subjectivity or imagination, superstition, obsession with power and toughness, cynicism, projectivity, exaggerated anxieties about sex. These traits tended to cluster. They manifested as pseudo-rebellion defiance that actually reinforces the rules prejudice and this strong identification with powerful figures.
But it's not real strength they get from identifying with authority.
No, it's borrowed strength, a way to compensate for the inner witness. The source calls it vicarious participation as a lieutenant. You feel powerful by obeying, by being part of the dominant group, but it masks a deep submissiveness.
So the overall picture is pretty bleak. A society built on control and treating people like things damages our inner lives, makes genuine connection and critical thought incredibly difficult, leading to alienation from ourselves, nature, each other, a kind of damaged life.
It's a stark diagnosis, definitely.
Hmm.
But for Adorno, you had to confront this bleakness head-on to even begin to understand the depth of the problem. You can't fix what you don't understand.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, this wrong life, this damaged self, what kind of philosophy can even address it? Adorno's own approach, negative dialectics, sounds, well, negative and difficult.
It is difficult, and deliberately so. And yes, it's anti-systematic. Unlike philosophers trying to build these grand, all-encompassing systems, Adorno was deeply suspicious of that. He felt systems inevitably force reality into molds, imposing identity on things that aren't identical. His goal was different: to capture the irreducible subject-object relation rationally without reduction. Holding that tension, negative dialectics is partly a critique of philosophy itself, trying to expose its own hidden assumptions, especially its bias towards identity thinking.
And he felt traditional epistemology, the theory of knowledge, missed crucial things. Like suffering, emotion, the raw feel of experience, the somatic, the sensory.
Exactly. He argued traditional concepts aim for the universal what things share, but they struggle with the sheer particularity, the uniqueness you grasp through direct experience, through feeling. Concepts are essential, of course, but they always simplify. They reduce the richness of the object to what fits the category. Experience, for Adorno, always goes further. It overflows our concepts.
So how does his philosophy try to bridge that gap? How can we think about the particular, the stuff that doesn't fit the concepts?
This gets us to his core critique of identity thinking. That's the ingrained habit in Western thought of equating the thing with a concept, subsuming the particular entirely under the universal, ignoring or suppressing the non-identity. The non-identical is that aspect of the object or experience that resists being fully captured, the part that's unique, contradictory, or just, more than the concept allows.
And this connects to his idea of the priority of the object.
Absolutely fundamental. He hammers this home. The object isn't just something we construct in our minds. It has its own reality, its own qualities that push back against our assumptions. This resistance, this lack of coherence between our concept and the object, isn't a failure. It demands a rational response. It forces us to revise our thinking, to acknowledge the limits of our concepts.
The sources compare it to Hegel's master-slave dialectic, that knowing isn't static. It's this dynamic struggle where both the knower and the known are transformed. Trying to truly understand something, whether it's a person or a social issue, means constantly pushing past our first, maybe simplistic ideas.
It's a constant process. And this leads to Adorno's specific take on contradiction, which is different from Hegel's. For Hegel, contradiction drives reality. For Adorno, contradiction is more like a warning sign. It indicates the untruth of identity. It shows us where our concept fails, the fact that the concept does not exhaust the thing conceived.
So contradiction reveals the limit of our thinking, the non-identical part.
Precisely. He calls it non-identity under the aspect of identity. It's the clash. And he warns, if you let either pure identity thinking or pure non-identity thinking take over either rigid dogma or just abandoning concepts altogether, thought collapses back into myth. Negative dialectics tries to stay in that uncomfortable space, to be experience sensitive, tracking how things actually unfold with all their swerves and halts, like listening closely to complex music or observing social life without jamming it into preconceived boxes.
That sounds like a really demanding, constantly self-correcting way to think.
It is, and it connects to another key idea, the disenchantment of the concept. He calls this the antidote of philosophy. It means becoming aware of how our concepts rely on the non-conceptual.
Okay, non-conceptual. Is that like raw data before thought?
Not exactly raw data. The sources clarify it's not some pure realm outside thought. It's more like the accumulated historical, social, human significance embedded in an object or concept. All the layers of meaning from how it's been used and experienced. These meanings aren't static. You have to figure out how they're subjectively lived, how they're woven into social life. To make something seem static, purely conceptual, you have to actively strip away this history that's part of the logic of disenchantment he's critiquing.
So the non-conceptual is like the blind spot in our standard categorizing thought, the experiential stuff that gets ignored.
You can put it that way. It's the experiential conditions of philosophical concepts that often get overlooked. And becoming aware of this dependence, Adorno thinks, reveals deep truths, not just about our thinking, but about the social power structures that shape it. One source contrasts him with Wittgenstein here. Both see language depends on social practice. But for Adorno, uncovering this reveals social truth, maybe exposes reification. For Wittgenstein, it might be more about dissolving philosophical problems by showing they arise from linguistic confusion. Adorno always ties philosophical problems back to social processes.
That link between how we know epistemology and the social conditions of knowing sociology seems absolutely key to his whole project.
It's fundamental. Which brings us to another tricky concept, mimesis. Now, this isn't just simple imitation for Adorno. He doesn't see it as some separate irrational way of knowing. It's more like a demand within rational thought itself, an archaic mode of likening oneself to an object. It's about letting the concept be drawn towards the object, letting it measure themselves by what in the object searches for expression.
So an old way of relating, still alive inside our rational thinking.
Kind of, yeah. That urge to find concordance that fit between knower and known lives on, even if suppressed. Adorno argues if you completely stamp out this mimetic impulse, genuinely knowing the object becomes impossible, unintelligible. Mimesis doesn't fight rationality, it should blend with it, constantly reminding concepts to stay open, to try and grasp the more that they can't quite articulate yet.
So it's about using concepts flexibly, critically, aware of their limits, trying to be sensitive to the object's uniqueness.
That's the goal. He criticized thinkers like Bergson for setting up a sharp divide concept versus intuition. Adorno says, no, you get under the concept, access that mimetic layer, by going through the concept, pushing it to reveal its own limits.
And finally, in this philosophical toolkit, he uses Kant's idea of the idea in a special way, to talk about the non-identical, the stuff that escapes our neat conceptual boxes.
Exactly. For Adorno, the idea points towards the infinite, the boundless, what's always more than any finite concept can grasp. It pushes back against philosophies that claim to have final, complete answers. By calling the non-identical an idea, he protects it. It points beyond our grasp, which guards against relativism. Anything goes. But it also guards against traditional metaphysics that falsely claims it can fully capture the absolute right here, right now.
The source even draws a parallel with Derrida and his idea of the interminable delay of finding ultimate foundations.
Yeah, the suggestion is both thinkers see systems of thought as inherently unstable because they contain these absolute claims they can never fully satisfy. It's another way Adorno emphasizes the importance of what resists our systems, the potential reality that identity thinking misses.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Because for Adorno, all these philosophical complexities and social critiques weren't just abstract. They played out vividly in aesthetics, especially in music. He saw art as this crucial, though complicated space.
He absolutely did. He saw artworks, especially challenging modern music. Schoenberg, late Beethoven, were key examples for him as paradigmatic for a reformed conceptuality. They embody the kind of thinking, the tensions and self-corrections he wanted philosophy to adopt.
How does a piece of music work like a philosophical method?
Well, he argued that experiencing art, real aesthetic experience, isn't just passive consumption or ticking off features. It's active. You go beyond just recognizing things. You select details, relate them in complex ways, and this pushes understanding beyond simple labeling or categorization. This involves what he called aesthetic negativity.
Aesthetic negativity.
It's this idea that artworks, especially challenging ones, have a kind of self-subversive quality in how they arrange their elements. They generate friction, they include material that doesn't fit neatly, the unselected material.
So the artwork itself kind of pushes back against being easily understood or consumed.
That's the idea. Grappling with that resistance, the stringent experience of aesthetic negativity is, for Adorno, the experience of the beautiful. Not just pretty harmony, but confronting the work's refusal to be simple. This allows for evaluating the art on its own terms, somewhat independently of whether it's useful or true in a non-artistic sense. It reveals the hidden dependence, the latent heteronomy of judging art by external standards. But he's careful here. This aesthetic resistance stays mostly within the aesthetic sphere. It doesn't automatically translate into political action or ethical truth in the outside world.
But he definitely saw a strong connection between music, consciousness, and social control outside of that high art sphere, right?
Absolutely. He talked about forms of obeisance, how people unthinkingly conform to social norms and cultural products. He saw these not just as individual failings, but as deeply ingrained modes of consciousness, structures shaped by society. And music, especially popular music, played a huge role here, had a powerful cognitive function, shaping how people thought and perceived within modernity.
He famously categorized listeners and lamented the decline of the type 2 listener, the person who could engage structurally, thoughtfully, even if not a professional musician.
Yes, he felt that type was disappearing as music became more specialized on the production side and more about passive consumption, on the lifting side, a word he really hated in this context. And this decline wasn't just about musical taste. It signaled a waning of music's capacity as an aid to cognition and therefore critical consciousness. As listening became about fetishizing hooks, distraction, or mere background stimulation, his other listener types, the ability to engage with complex structures, faded. And that, for him, weakened reason itself, making people more susceptible to manipulation.
He even called emotional listening, just focusing on feeling, an abdication of reason. That's harsh.
It is very strong. But he saw music as having this potential to be a mental workout, a way to model complex mediated realities. Losing that structural listening was a loss for critical thinking, for intellectual independence, and ultimately, he thought, for democracy itself, which needs critically engaged citizens.
That's a pretty grim view of music's role under the culture industry. But do the sources suggest any way music can still be a resource for agency? For doing or thinking differently, maybe even resisting?
Yes, there's a contrast explored here. While Adorno focused on the constraints, other perspectives highlighted by the sources see music offering affordances, possibilities for action, thought, feeling. But these affordances aren't just inherent in the music. They depend heavily on how it's heard, how it's delineated or interpreted by the listener in a specific situation.
How do these affordances work?
Music offers possibilities when we hear it as embodying meanings beyond just the sounds, social meanings, historical weight, emotional qualities that link to our lives. It becomes active when we use it, when our perception leads to action or changes our thinking, like dancers moving to a rhythm, or someone using a song structure to think through a problem. Our actions and contexts also shape the music's meaning. It's interactive.
So it's about the interaction, not just the music itself.
Exactly. And memory is huge here. Music connects to styles of consciousness through memory, not just that's our song, but memories of skills, social situations, ways of being, gestures, the whole texture of everyday life. Music can trigger these deep-seated memories and ways of being.
And then there are the conventions, the symbolic meanings built up over time.
Right, like Bach using E minor for the cross, or just recognizing Mozart's style versus Hendrix's. These conventions shape our habits, but they can also be played with, subverted, used to create new meanings and possibilities.
Thinking about music today, instant access to everything anyone can create and share, online communities, but also algorithms and huge platforms dominating. Through Adorno's lens, but also considering these affordances, is music today mostly a tool of control, or are there still real spaces for agency, critique, resistance? It feels like it has to be both, right?
That tension is unavoidable, I think. The same platforms pushing predictable hits also host incredibly niche, experimental, or political music. Someone creating a protest song on their laptop and sharing it, a band deliberately breaking formulas, a listener actively seeking out challenging sounds instead of just letting the algorithm decide. These could all be seen as moments where music acts as a resource for agency, maybe modeling a different way of thinking, even within the system. But the pressure to conform, to be easily digestible, is always there.
So pulling these threads together, the critique of a controlling culture and alienated society, the complex philosophy trying to grasp reality without crushing it, the double-edged role of art and music, it all leads to Adorno's views on ethics, on trying to live a good life.
And his perspective here is, again, famously challenging, quite pessimistic, many find. He essentially argued that the traditional job of philosophy teaching the good life, giving ethical rules, had become impossible. The very possibility for any straightforwardly good life at all under contemporary conditions, he felt, had disintegrated.
Disintegrated, that's incredibly strong.
His argument was that in a fundamentally wrong life, a society structured by alienation and instrumental reason, even our most personal attempts at goodness, love, friendship, family, are forced to carry an impossible burden. They become the only places we look for genuine value, putting them under intolerable stress. He argued there's no clean separation between our private lives and the surrounding social conditions. The wrongness seeps into everything.
And his refusal to just give ethical rules wasn't just giving up, it was a specific philosophical point.
Yes. One source puts his denial very precisely. No action we take right now within this damaged reality can be unconditionally good or worthy, uncompromised, not a further abetting of what they mean to resist, and consistent with their own normative presuppositions.
Wow. So even our best intentions, our attempts to do good, are somehow tainted or compromised by the system itself. They might even unintentionally prop up the thing we're trying to fight.
That's the incredibly difficult challenge he poses. And it's the heart of his book, Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life. It's not a how-to guide for ethics. It's a collection of fragments exploring the whole context of wrong life, questioning if morality, if living well, is even truly possible anymore under these conditions.
That really forces you, the listener, to think about how the structures Adorno diagnosed the culture industry, economic pressures, psychological damage might be impacting your own efforts to live ethically or authentically. It suggests your best intentions don't exist in a vacuum. They're tangled up in a world that for him is fundamentally compromised. It makes living ethically seem incredibly fraught.
It certainly challenges easy notions of individual moral heroism. It pushes the focus towards the societal structures that enable or disable ethical life.
So, after wrestling with all this, what's Adorno's lasting importance? What should we take away?
Well, the sources point to several things. He laid crucial groundwork for critical theory, providing concepts and a framework for diagnosing modern society. He constantly pushes us to be aware of that complex, tense relationship between our thinking and the reality it tries to grasp, the subject-object relation. And maybe most enduringly, he offers this profound, if deeply uncomfortable, diagnosis of what's wrong. How reason can turn against itself, how culture becomes control, how individuals get damaged, and how hard it is to find the good life in a wrong one.
He doesn't just describe it. The sources say he prompts us to relentlessly critique and reject the world as it is.
Exactly. He helps diagnose why things are not different and what precisely is wrong, even if he doesn't hand out easy answers. He gives you the sharp tools for analysis, even if not the blueprint for reconstruction.
This has definitely been a deep dive. We've navigated Theodor Adorno's critique of a culture industry that shapes consciousness and a society marked by alienation. We've tackled his demanding philosophy, negative dialectics, non-identity, mimesis, his attempt to think against the grain. We've looked at art and music as contested sites of control and potential resistance. And we've confronted his challenging view on the near impossibility of living an undamaged, ethical life today.
And hopefully, these ideas, demanding as they are, offer you some powerful lenses. Lenses to examine your own world, the media you encounter, the music that moves you, the social dynamics you navigate, the very real challenges of trying to live with integrity in complex, often compromising circumstances. His analysis of things like dependency, projection, the pseudo-individual, they might resonate, perhaps uncomfortably, with things you see around you or even in yourself.
And given Adorno's profound skepticism, his view that even our attempts to resist or find pockets of goodness can be subtly undermined by the overarching wrong life, it leaves us with a pretty tough question to mull over, one that pushes beyond what we've explicitly covered. Where, if anywhere in the world he described, can we find genuine, unreified, rational relations between individuals? Those moments of authentic connection, free from manipulation, or even just that tiny kernel of experience that truly resists being shaped and mediated by satiety. And maybe even harder, how would you even recognize such moments, let alone protect or cultivate them against all the pressures he diagnosed?
That's definitely something to keep thinking about long after this conversation ends.